welcome to all of you watching us today from Sri Lanka and around the world. Now today we are here at the University of Kenia in Sri Lanka to have an exclusive discussion with Professor Robin Coningham. He is the UNESCO Chair Professor and the Professor of Archaeology at the University of Durham. Thank you for joining us today to have, I know your schedule is pretty tight and you're in Sri Lanka for a short visit. So thank you for taking the time to speak to us today.
I'm delighted to be here and I will attempt to answer as many of your questions
so
as I can.
I hope you're doing good and you have enjoyed your stay in Sri Lanka for now.
It's wonderful to be back. This is the first time I've been back since COVID, so it's wonderful to be back and actually to be seeing what's happening in terms of archaeology in the sites.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So to start things off, let's talk about your journey as an established archaeologist in Sri Lanka and around the world. You've done some marvelous work. How did this all start?
It all started mainly because my parents had a passion for historic buildings. So as children at weekends we'd be taken and then I decided at the age of 15 when I was a schoolboy that the best way to fill my summers was by volunteering for excavations. So from 15 every summer I would disappear on an excavation and then I found you could actually study it at university. So I studied archaeology at university and never left university.
So that is how you actually got into this field. So Professor, let's talk about, you have visited Sri Lanka a few times as you mentioned. From when you visited and where you are right now, let's talk about the current status in terms of archaeology in Sri Lanka. What is the status like?
Of course, when I first came here it was 1989. So it was a very different time, quite a difficult time in the history of Sri Lanka. And at that time I was an undergraduate who just transferred onto a PhD program. I was exceptionally lucky because there were some pioneering archaeologists at that time. Saran Deriniagala, who was then at that time working in Anuradhapura, there was Seneca Bandaranayake, who was working Sigiriya, Dambulla, and Roland Silva, whose concept of the cultural triangle was so exciting that actually it could charge tourists hard currency and instead of that returning to treasury, going straight back into the preservation and presentation of that of the sites to visitors in the world. So at that time I think Sri Lanka had taken a view that either it could send its young scholars to foreign universities or it could try to develop its own techniques, its own methods in-house. So the PGIAR was born and it started producing a generation of archaeologists who have undoubtedly progressed the field. Those pioneers I mentioned, Professor Bandaranayake, Dr. Deriniagala, laid the foundations. But in a way there were challenges in that archaeology is a global field.
Definitely.
Techniques are changing continually and often those techniques are from medicine, from physics, and looking globally, archaeology can actually adapt different techniques and improve. And I think at the moment in Sri Lanka it's been very successful, but actually there are techniques now available which are transformative. Which can transform the way we question and also the way we work. Two in particular I'm thinking, one is geophysical survey, which is transformational. We've been using this in Nepal for the last 10 years and actually we've been arguing that it's the ideal technique to introduce to in a way revolutionize and improve the methods of archaeology here in Sri Lanka.
Well, Professor, in terms of education for archaeology, from a global perspective, what do you think Sri Lanka as a country, what do you think are some of the methods we could implement to enhance the quality of our education in terms of archaeology?
I think the degrees here are strong. The Postgraduate Institute of Archaeology is a very strong organization. There are a number of senior professors who are not frightened of new techniques, and actually very encouraging of them being piloted.
Which is a good thing.
Which is an excellent thing, because not all techniques are translatable from one area to another. So for example, Professor Gunawardena here at Kenia, Professor Adhikari at the Postgraduate Institute, they've been really encouraging for us to use geophysical survey.
Okay.
A geophysical survey is a way that one can actually start to revolutionize the way one sees the field. Traditionally, archaeologists will excavate a hole. You can't always be sure what you'll find. You might lose all your money. You might just in a place which reveals nothing. Geophysical survey changes that perspective. Where we've been using it in Nepal, it's been incredibly successful. For example, we've been working on a site called Tilarakot Kapilavastu. It's identified by many as the childhood home of the Buddha, ancient Kapilavastu. When you visit it, it was just a grass mound with some trees. You could see no archaeology.
Okay.
We did geophysical survey. Now, when you take clay, it has a particular magnetism.
Right.
When you take clay and you fire it in a kiln to turn it into a brick, its magnetism intensifies. So if you take a magnetic reading every 25 centimeters, you begin to pick up areas near bricks which are highly magnetic, areas outside bricks which are low magnetism. When you map, as we do, areas of 20 hectares, what you find without excavating is entire city plans. You can pick up individual buildings, you can pick up, for example, brick-lined reservoirs, stupas, viharas, without excavating. And it means then you can start asking the questions before you excavate. What is the nature of this building? How do we date it? We've used it, we've trialled it here in Sri Lanka inside Jaffna Fort. So when you go into Jaffna Fort, inside those Dutch colonial walls, there's a beautiful green parade ground. It's empty. When we did geophysics there, we picked up evidence of a Portuguese church below the surface. Now, below the grass, without excavating. When we did actually excavate, we found that the Dutch had removed the foundations, just leaving the trench. So without excavating, you survey, and that allows you to start questioning and strategically placing where you would like to. In a way, it's similar to, say, a CT scan or an X-ray. It gives us the ability as archaeologists to actually start questioning before we start, and that is revolutionary. So that's been trialled for the first time in Jaffna. It's worked remarkably well. It's something we are keen, particularly for the great cities, the great monasteries within the island, which are too many to excavate. It would cost too much money. The conservation, the moment you excavate, you need to conserve. So this way, you can actually manage the underground heritage as sympathetically as you would the standing heritage.
In terms of technology from the 1990s, now we're in 2023, I'm sure there has been a drastic change in technology and the machines and all of that as well, isn't it?
Yes, I mean the geophysics has probably been around for 20 years, but it's becoming more accurate and more advanced and also smaller and cheaper.
Really?
So now they are more affordable, and it's the training that's needed. The other aspect is dating, because within the island of Sri Lanka there is, of course, this wonderful Pali textual record. There's the inscriptions as well, which give a sense of history. Archaeology sometimes supports that history, sometimes gives a fuller picture of that history. And actually we use something called optically stimulated luminescence dating, which, for example, there's been a debate as to the development of Sri Lanka's famous tank system, irrigation system. Now, the debate has mainly been around the Mahavamsa might comment on the construction by a king of a tank. Now we have techniques where, by excavating into the bunds, we can actually record when that bund was constructed, plus or minus 30 or 50 years. Now, 20 years ago, we couldn't dream of the technologies which would allow us to do that. And it allows us to have a far more granular understanding of the development, the maintenance, and also the collapse of civilization as we see within the north central province of, particularly of Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka. Professor Robin, you're in Sri Lanka, what are you currently working on? What was the main purpose of this visit this time?
Purpose of this visit was to re-establish connections. I have some very long-standing research partnerships because I've always been aware that many foreign archaeologists like myself, we can go to India, we can go to Pakistan, Nepal or Sri Lanka, but actually networks also need to be powerful for scholars within that region. So working within Nepal, we've been very keen to work with the Central Cultural Fund here in Sri Lanka to bring archaeologists to Nepal to experience that work. And similarly, Central Cultural Fund, when Professor Gunnar Wardner was Director General, Nepali archaeologists came and worked at Jaffna. They came and worked at Polonnaruwa.
Wow.
So partly it's to reconnect those, but also there's a conference on what we know about Sri Lanka's cities, and also what are still gaps, what are the new techniques that can be used. And so it's an opportunity for us to talk to younger scholars, because many of us are becoming slightly older, and also to talk to students who will be the ones who will be responsible for researching and curating. So we have 2 days of academic work inside a room, and then we're going out to visit Polonnaruwa and also Anuradhapura.
Professor, how important are religious sites in Sri Lanka? The importance of it?
I think they are highly significant, partly because they are part of the urban history of the island. When you look at a city like Anuradhapura or like Polonnaruwa, you can see that there is the urban core, but also the religious core. And the religious core is equally as important as the urban. And when you look at the material that's been excavated, you see Chinese ceramics, you see early Islamic material, you see material that's been traded in from lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and it gives you an idea that whilst these may look like failed cities, skeletal cities in the jungle, actually once they were mercantile hubs. They were there partly for trade, partly they were there to cater for ancient pilgrimage and veneration. And I think when one tends to think of tourism today, one tends to think of people going on holiday. Actually, transnational movement is nothing new here. We have the Chinese pilgrim descriptions of Anuradhapura with thousands of monks. We have evidence of traded material and people. So the ancient cities were significant not only as economic centres, but also centres for religious journeys. And I think increasingly, many of those who undertake long distance journeys are taking them for religious purposes, purposes other than pure sort of tourism or pleasure.
Professor, you're also working very closely with the work at the Mahara. Let's talk a little bit about that as well.
Yes, I've always felt that the Mahara has been neglected. If you visit Anuradhapura, the focus of the World Heritage activities was very much Jetavana Abhigiri. Respectfully, they are magnificent constructions, fascinating sets of organizations. But the Mahara was the oldest establishment, the first establishment. When one walks there, you see Thuparama, Runveli Saya, but actually below the surface is that initial development of what becomes Theravada Buddhism. Now, the later period, everything is in stone. the earlier structures were all timber. Sri Lanka has this very, very strong tradition of timber in the early years, and then it's superseded by stone. What would be fascinating is to understand, has the architectural style changed? The tiered roofs, the pagoda style roofs, have they changed over time? Are these new introduction, or is that vernacular architecture? So I think in terms of the Mahara, it's been slightly left alone, which in a way is perfect for the introduction of new technologies. So we're really keen to try to see how can we begin to transform the understanding.
Are there any plans underway, Professor?
There are some plans, so we are looking at actually pulling together a design, a co-design, a design which would allow us to revisit the early phases of the Mahara, but also to look at which techniques might work there. But also we're aware these are living sites, and the experience that I've had working since 2013 at Lumbini and also at Tilarakot Kapilavastu is that the archaeology cannot purely be research. We have a responsibility at living sites of also sharing the information dissemination. I had the privilege of excavating within the Maya Devi temple at Lumbini, and we were working in advance of conservation work, and we found a series of two earlier previously unknown structures under the floor of the Emperor Asoka's temple. So the earliest of which was a simple timber structure dating to the 6th century BCE. Now, what we found is that pilgrims are fascinated by the historicity, the moment that actually what has almost been a tradition, they can actually see evidence of it, evidence of early practice, an understanding of how the earliest Buddhist monks behaved, practiced, and the archaeology gives them this direct connectivity with the past.
That's true.
And we've found that actually there's been a real interest in information. Not everyone wants to become an archaeologist or an academic, but for example, we had a temporary exhibition in Taiwan with the Foguanshan Buddhist Museum there. In 3 months, we had 1 million visitors who just came to look at the results of the archaeology. Many of them then wanted to go to Lumbini itself. So I think we need to think about how information is disseminated. It can either be buried within an academic volume, or else dissemination through exhibitions, dissemination through conferences and workshops are core. So for this co-design, I think it's important that we learn those lessons from Lumbini, because this is such a significant site, particularly for the Theravada world, where we have a connectivity, a connection with Myanmar, with Thailand, with Southeast Asia, with the transmission and exchange of Buddhism. And here is Sri Mahabodhi right there. You know, those historical linkages are as strong as ever. It's just, in a way, now maybe people imagine Anuradhapura as a tourist site, looking from outside, rather than a site of pilgrimage, which it has been for millennia.
Professor, what do you think we could do as a country to change things for the better of archaeology in Sri Lanka?
I would say your national institutions are strong. The universities are as strong as anywhere else in South Asia. And I think in a way is to be open to partnerships within SARC, and actively engaging with colleagues in India, within Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, because sharing those those similar challenges is key. And I would say to continue welcoming and selecting which elements of technology are useful, will work well, and which elements are not needed. So I would say what used to happen, that great sort of brain drain of sending everyone abroad for their education, isn't necessary. You have very strong institutions here. But actually it's recognizing which challenges can't you meet and which challenges new technology, new applications can actually begin to address. And in a way this conference is a perfect example of that, because we've discussed different new techniques which are available, and it's which of those are of interest and application here.
Professor, now Sri Lanka is a very tourist-driven economy, and what do you think the relationship is that coming in between tourism and the Mahavihara?
I think the two can balance together.
Right.
My experience working within Nepal is that there are two very distinctive sectors. There is a sector of tourism driven from East Asia and also Europe and America, which is interested in mountains. You know, they come trekking, they may do a bit of wildlife.
Yeah.
For the southern part of Nepal, it's very much pilgrimage. And the intensity of archaeological work and engagement with religious communities has seen numbers move from about 20,000 in 1990s to 1.2, 1.3 million. Now, when you think of the Gurkha earthquake 2015, which was extremely tough on Nepal, tourism dropped. Actually, pilgrimage picked up quicker.
Really?
So to some extent, you could actually argue that a pilgrimage determination is far more resilient than someone looking for a place to go on holiday. And at the moment, most of the offer within Sri Lanka is around tourism and attractions. There is a real potential for pilgrimage. And within that, the earliest advent of the development of Buddhism, Mahavihara, could be a window onto that. But I suppose even in the UK, we found multiple interests, multiple sectors, means that you divide your risks. So it is a growing attraction, particularly with middle class growth in India, within East Asia, and people's determination to visit places of such significance.
And it's all about striking the balance between all of it.
It's all about striking the balance, and also being aware of, particularly I found, historicity. People want to make that connection with the past.
Yeah.
So, and also everyone likes a bit of discovery.
That's true.
It's whether it's landing on the moon or archaeological discovery, it still is something that motivates and fascinates people.
Professor, you're also based in Nepal, as you were mentioning. Let's talk a bit about your work there as well, as an established archaeologist.
Part of that is based at Lumbini, which is, in a way, Lumbini has benefited from pilgrimage, from huge numbers of pilgrimage. But of course those come with challenges. You need shade, you need lavatories, you need water, you need accommodation, and also the extent to which the benefits are translated to people living locally. So we've been working almost in the shadow of huge development projects to try to protect the archaeology that people are coming to see. So there is always this tension between development and protection, but for us it's really how can we see local communities to benefit. And then the other aspect that's come through is traditional knowledge systems. So there is a desire, we found, an interest in just translating Western science, engineering techniques, mega infrastructure. This was particularly a case after the earthquake in Nepal. We undertook a series of post-disaster rescue excavations in Kathmandu after the earthquake.
Yeah.
What we found was that vernacular architecture, timber, mud mortars, some of the buildings failed, but when we started dating those buildings, they'd stood for 1,000 years. And when we began to look at the reasons for the collapse, working with engineers, we found that this was more to do with modern poor maintenance than design. Buildings had been designed to withstand seismic movement. So for us now, we're interested in water management, sustainability, learning from the past. So the past is not just about unlocking history, burying ourselves in the past. It's also how we can learn from the past about sustainable contemporary futures. So looking both ways, we believe firmly that archaeology is about recording the past, but also if we can contribute to the discussions about sustainability and about traditional knowledge systems, then those are also equally important.
In the industry of archaeology, coming back to Sri Lanka, do you think we are ready as a country to face any challenge that might happen in terms of weather, I don't know, climate change? Are we ready as a country?
I've recently written a paper and I was looking at some of the old overseas development agencies' evaluations of Victoria Dam. Now, Victoria Dam, as you're aware, was partly a loan from the UK government. When you look at the reports about it, it did not deliver what it promised. It displaced many people, it heightened malaria, it flooded very valuable, fertile paddy land. It never quite delivered. It was mega infrastructure, and often donors or people, contractors loaning, like big projects. But actually, if you compare that with the resilience you get through the gravity tank system, actually you get hugely more. And one of the papers we heard today was about the development of that irrigation system and its maintenance. I believe that actually we're quite close to seeing how archaeology can start unlocking more about water harvesting, maintenance, and also if we think about the gravity system, it's a way where you don't need a huge administration and bureaucracy. Actually, much of it is community custodianship. So looking at those, and I know that the Food Agency Organization of the UN have identified the gravity tank system in Sri Lanka as a heritage agricultural system, acknowledging that if you have a cyclone, and we have to face it with climate change, cyclones, unpredictability is with us for the future. Actually, these are far more resilient systems than the mega infrastructure. So partly I'm interested in Mahara because you had populations of thousands. How was water curated? How was it harvested and managed in the past? And what can we learn from the past to actually implement into the future? And I believe that in Sri Lanka there is a desire from academics to realize, and this was my keynote address yesterday, to say that we need to be interdisciplinary. We also need to have the confidence that actually we can offer to those discussions, because if we learn from the past, we can actually help improve the future.
Professor, you are working very closely with the University of Kenia here in Sri Lanka. Let's talk about that partnership as well.
Kenia University feels like a second home. Many of its staff I've been working with since 1989 when I was a student. And I think it's more than an academic partnership. it's one based on trust, and also of mutual interest. Our publications are shared, so they have an excellent department, but with all departments the challenges are, how do we assist the next generation to have the same sorts of benefits than we do? Now, between 2005 and 2010, my university, Durham, and also Kenia University, MS University of Baroda, held a huge project around Anuradhapura.
Okay.
During that time, we trained over 500 students, some of mine, some from Kenia. Some of them are now senior lecturers here in Kenia. So actually, we see that relationship being symbiotic, that we share understandings, we can share technologies, but also in the same way, Professor Adhikari, for example, has taught me a huge amount about ethnoarchaeology. So it is about mutual benefit from knowledge exchange, and Kenia is an extremely strong department, and also it's one that's based on not just theory, but data. And for data, we need to be in the field, and the best way for students to learn is through that. And therefore, Kenia is significant in terms of the archaeological picture here.
What would you tell, or how would you advise the next generation of archaeologists heading into the fields in excavations or wanting to pursue a career in this field?
I think the world has changed since I was a student. When I was a student, I was sent up on my own to Anuradhapura in 1989, and I was given 120 workmen and told, I'll see you in 3 years. That world, I'm glad, has changed. Now, the advice I would give them is, do not be frightened of being interdisciplinary, to actually recognize the limits of archaeology and how geoarchaeology, how engineering can contribute. So to see the linkages from one's own discipline and see how working with other disciplines can help. So at this conference we've had geographers, the Vice-Chancellor who came, she is of course a medic, and she was talking about parasites and malaria, which are all linked to these questions of how do we, for example, understand water systems. So I'd say to them, be bold always, but also to look at those linkages to other disciplines, and also when you can, go into the field, because there's nothing better than learning in the field practically rather than only learning theoretically.
Professor, what does the future look like to you?
Personally, or
in terms of archaeology, personally?
Yes, in terms of archaeology, I believe that archaeology actually has a crossroads. We can either continue to be pure researchers, sitting in laboratories, writing papers for ourselves, sitting in holes, digging holes, writing papers for one another, or we can recognize that we have a role to play more generally, a role that can touch the lives of literally millions through working on living sites, balancing development with protection, with understanding the nature of early religious behavior and pilgrimage. But also I think we have a role to play with understanding ancient technological systems and seeing how many of them are not redundant, but actually offer very real sustainable alternatives to mega infrastructure. My question is whether archaeologists will have the nerve sometimes to fail, because often we will fail, and whether the funders will have the confidence that actually archaeology can contribute more than currently it has. But it's clear if we don't adapt, we don't make ourselves relevant, we run the risk of perhaps being less significant than we could be.
Professor, my final question for you is, let's hear your perspective on the future of archaeology for us as Sri Lankans.
Archaeology can play a role in a sustainable future.
Yeah.
I think it would also be true to say archaeology in the past can also be weaponized. Weaponized. So we've seen many examples across the world how archaeology is utilized by popular movements. Archaeology can also shed light, for example, on cosmopolitanism. So if you look at the material culture that we find at Anuradhapura, as I mentioned, we have Chinese pottery, we have early Islamic pottery, we have connections with North India. We're dealing with worlds which were multinational, multicultural. The past was as complex as the present.
Yeah.
So I think part of the challenge is aligning archaeology with a purpose, again, which is partly those knowledge systems, but also being aware that that archaeology can be used for good, but also it can be used to divide as well.
All right, Professor, thank you very much for joining us today to have this conversation, and wishing you nothing but the very best. And I want to thank you on behalf of all of us as Sri Lankans for taking that step in visiting our country and doing your best to promote all our sites and doing nothing but the best for our country as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And also all I can say is, having been a student here in '89, all I've ever had is very good lessons, and I hope I can return something positive as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we were in conversation with Professor Robin Coningham, UNESCO Chair Professor and Professor of Archaeology at the University of Durham. So thank you for joining us today, and that brings us to the end of an exclusive discussion here at the University of Kenia in Sri Lanka.